Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Orthodox Priest Reacts. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for your support, and it looked like you really enjoyed our last episode. So in that vein, we're going to continue on, and this time we're reacting to The Chosen, Episode 2 of Season 1, Shabbat.
We honor our fellow citizens on Shabbat.
Strangers often?
We are all God's people, even friends we haven't met.
So I like the beginnings of the two chosen episodes that we've seen so far because they take us back into Old Testament times, give us a little bit of context, and then they move us forward. In this particular one, which was set in Kinnereth in about the 10th century, which was a very difficult time for the Jews because they had the Philistines, they had Amorites, they had many people that they were warring with. And she makes this interesting statement in answer to what her son asked, saying, "We welcome God's people, even strangers." I don't really think at that time they would have been so welcoming to strangers, especially when those strangers were oppressing them. So now here, it looks like they're having a Shabbat meal, and he comes out and says, the Eshet Chayil, which is the woman of valor, opening. And this comes from the last chapter in Proverbs, which was the wisdom of King Solomon. I like the way that they did this because this is done even in the Jewish homes today. And so this verse talks about, and they're not really quite sure if they're talking about a particular woman or if they're talking about a nation, but the way that it's used today in the Jewish home at the Shabbat dinner is that this is meant to honor the matriarch of the family as this woman of valor. So I thought that was nicely done. So one last commentary on this Old Testament scene, right at the end when they're talking to the child and they say the masculine names and then they also say some feminine names.
May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah.
And it's interesting because this is what we say at the end of the wedding service. So in the Orthodox service book, I say to the bride at the very end, "And you, O bride, be glorified like Sarah, be glad like Rebecca, multiply like Rachel, rejoice in your husband, observe the requirements of the law, for so God is well pleased." So it's kind of nice to see that little bit of Jewish flair incorporated in our wedding service.
Financial stability.
I am aware of his responsibilities. I don't think you know what he's capable
And if
of.
he's made a deal with this Simon person, I have valuable information related to his job.
Have you ever heard of somebody making a decision based on a hunch?
So this one, I'm not really sure about this dialogue between the Roman centurion and Matthew. The Roman centurion is trying to tell him, you don't know who you're dealing with here. And he insists on wanting to say something to the proconsul here. If you had advice from a centurion who says, this is not a good idea, I don't see why he would have stressed that he wants to go and talk. So if this is a play on his autism, that, OCD's got to go do this. But other than that, I don't think that realistically this is what would have happened.
Faster.
He was many months delinquent. To relieve the substantial amount of debt...
Skip to the end.
Now, this is not an Orthodox commentary, but it is more of a military commentary. I can't tell you how many times in the beginning of my military career I learned that phrase, skip to the end. So coming out of an engineering background, we tend to talk too much. And so what I learned in the military was bottom line up front. That's why I laughed, because I just thought it was so funny when Matthew's given all these details, and that was my commanders. They didn't even look up. They just said, skip to the end. Let's speed this up. So here we have something that's actually biblically based. It seems like Nicodemus has been called before the Sanhedrin to investigate a miracle. Obviously the miracle of healing of Mary Magdalene. The Sanhedrin would have had this responsibility, and in fact, we have biblical precedence for this in the raising of Lazarus, because in John chapter 11, we read that after the raising of Lazarus by Jesus, the Sanhedrin investigated this. Now, it may be a little bit out of context for Nicodemus to request to go and investigate this privately, but this investigation certainly has biblical precedence and something that the Sanhedrin would in fact have done. Now, just like that insertion of that tension between Peter and Andrew that we don't have in the gospel, we've got that same thing going on here between Nicodemus and his wife, this conversation that they were having. Now, we hardly know anything about Nicodemus, and the very little that we know is only present in John. This is nice to see a dimension of Nicodemus and kind of his quandary, if I could use that word, between what's going on with the healings, the Sanhedrin, the miracle that happened, and now this engagement with his wife. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting interplay there of some character developments that we have nothing at all in Scripture to relate back to this. I don't find anything in here that would be contrary to Scripture in terms of how Nicodemus is behaving. And certainly, there's no problem with him being married and obviously them having a marital conversation. And I don't see anything in here that's scripturally intolerant.
My name is Nicodemus. I ministered to you, Lilith.
I don't answer to that name. I am Mary. I was born Mary.
So here is another case where we don't have any scriptural evidence of Nicodemus conducting an investigation into the miracle that happened with Mary Magdalene. The other thing that's a little bit troubling is the fact of Nicodemus, as a Jewish elder, a Jewish leader, having this seeming private conversation with Mary Magdalene. Now, there's nothing in Jewish law that would prohibit that, but it's something that would not have been commonly done. So I think what I would have expected here is to see maybe another rabbi with him just in case.
He performs miracles and seeks no credit? What does he look like? Is he a member of Sanhedrin? Would you at least know him if you saw him again?
Now we have the true reason of an investigation by the Sanhedrin, because miracles were typically looked into for the possible coming of a Messiah. And so this is why we have Nicodemus now saying, wait a minute, somebody else? And so this would be the real intent of the Sanhedrin investigation, to discover if there was somebody who was performing a miracle and could potentially be a Messiah.
It wasn't until the Maccabees revolted and ushered in the Hasmonean dynasty that our worship was restored.
Nice commentary here by Nicodemus again. It seems like this episode I've commented a lot about Nicodemus because he seems to have been a focal point here. But in this scene close to the end, he talks about the Hasmonean tapestry. And then his wife asks him about it, and then he explains the story that is recorded in the book of Maccabees about the oppression of the Jews by King Antiochus IV and his attempts to forcibly Hellenize the Jewish people, which led to the Maccabean revolt in about 166 or 167, somewhere in that time frame, and they won their independence, and then out of that came the Hasmonean dynasty, and this is the tapestry that he's referring to. Another kind of interesting commentary here is that I believe it's in the Mishnah, this whole story of being oppressed by the Hellenizing efforts of Antiochus IV is recorded, and they say in there that the Jewish prayers were written on horns so that they can teach their children without then being punished. It's very, very similar to what happened to us as Greeks when we were oppressed by the Ottomans and we had our Glyptiko Skoli, or our secret school. So here at the end, we have this kind of back and forth between the Shabbat dinner at the Pharisees' house with Nicodemus and also with Mary Magdalene at her house. And we see Jesus here making the appearance right at the end. Now, what this is a really nice bookmark, because we had at the beginning of the episode a Shabbat dinner, and now here at the end of the episode we close with these two Shabbat dinners here. Now, would it be unusual for Jesus as a rabbi to have attended a Shabbat dinner? No, absolutely not. Do we have any evidence that he sat down with Mary Magdalene and had this dinner? We don't have any evidence of that either. But again, it's historical fiction, and I don't think it would have been necessarily, as we said before, biblically intolerant that Jesus could have sat down with her at some point. All right, so that wraps up episode number 2. Now, here, I think this episode was a little bit slower than the first episode, and there's a huge amount of historical fiction here. We have the accounts of Nicodemus, which we don't have any of that in the gospel. We have a lot of attention being paid to Mary Magdalene. Yes, she's in the gospel, but there's a lot of attention being drawn to her here. And then we also have this continuing character development of Peter and then his brother Andrew, and that's not in the scripture either. So for me, yes, the narrative was developed so that we can understand these characters a little bit better, but there wasn't really that historical aspect, I guess, that I was looking for in this particular episode. All right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Tune in next time where we'll be reacting to episode 3. And don't forget, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you soon.